Have you ever felt completely safe with someone, only to realize later that the safety was the very thing that confused you the most? Because there is a strange kind of emotional experience many people go through, where nothing looks wrong on the surface, no big fights, no obvious betrayal, no dramatic chaos. Everything feels calm, even stable. But deep inside, something feels unfinished. Something feels emotionally distant. And the most confusing part is that you cannot explain it clearly. You only feel it slowly, over time, like a quiet shift in energy that you cannot ignore anymore. This is where most people get trapped without even realizing it, because the human brain is wired to trust calmness. We are trained to believe that stability means safety. We assume that if someone is not causing stress, then they must be emotionally healthy. But psychology tells a deeper truth. Calm behavior is not always emotional availability. And emotional distance is not always obvious at the beginning. Sometimes it is disguised so well that it feels like maturity. And this is where the tragedy begins. There is a type of person who appears incredibly secure. They are not dramatic. They do not chase attention. They do not create emotional chaos. They often seem grounded, logical, and even self-sufficient. To most people, this looks like emotional strength, something to admire, something to trust. Because in a world full of inconsistency, someone who stays calm feels like a safe place to land. But what if that calmness is not emotional security, but emotional protection? What if it is not connection, but distance dressed as peace? This is the hidden world of the fake secure avoidant, a person who looks emotionally stable on the outside, but internally keeps intimacy at a safe distance. Not because they do not care, but because closeness itself feels overwhelming. For them, emotional connection is not just warmth, it is pressure. It is vulnerability. It is something that slowly takes away their sense of control. And control is what they protect the most. At first, you do not notice anything unusual. In fact, the beginning often feels surprisingly good. There is attention, but not intensity. There is kindness, but not dependency. There is presence, but not emotional depth that feels overwhelming. It feels balanced, mature, even peaceful. And that is exactly what makes it so powerful. Because your mind relaxes, your guard comes down. You start believing you have finally found something stable. But human psychology does something interesting here. When something feels slightly incomplete but mostly good, the brain fills in the missing parts with hope. You do not see what is missing. You imagine what could grow. You project emotional potential onto emotional limitation. And slowly, without realizing it, you start emotionally investing in possibility instead of reality. Then comes the shift. It is not sudden, it is not loud, it is subtle. Less emotional expression, slightly longer gaps in communication, a quieter tone when things get deeper, a natural pulling back whenever emotional closeness starts to increase. But because there is no clear rejection, your mind struggles to label it. And what cannot be labeled becomes confusion. This is the most powerful part of the entire dynamic, because confusion creates attachment. When you are confused, you try harder to understand. When you try harder to understand, you invest more attention. And when you invest more attention, your emotional involvement deepens. Without realizing it, you start working for connection instead of receiving it. You start adjusting yourself, softening your needs, lowering your emotional expectations, just to maintain something that still feels like it exists, but is slowly becoming distant. And here is the part most people miss. The avoidant pattern is not always obvious rejection, it is controlled closeness. Enough presence to keep hope alive, enough distance to avoid vulnerability. This creates a powerful psychological loop where you are never fully connected, but never fully disconnected either. And that in-between space is what keeps people stuck for far longer than they should be. But before going deeper into how this pattern forms and why it repeats so predictably, there is something important to understand. Because if you stay with this and truly follow the full breakdown, you will start to see something clearly that most people only realize after emotional exhaustion. You will begin to recognize the difference between real emotional security and emotional distance that looks like security. You will learn how early signs are hidden in plain sight and how your own mind can misinterpret calm behavior as safety when it is actually emotional limitation. And by the end of this journey, you will not just understand a pattern. You will be able to spot it early, before it pulls you into confusion, overthinking, and emotional dependency that slowly drains your clarity. security. But first, you need to understand why this kind of safe feeling can sometimes be the most misleading emotional experience of all. What makes this pattern even more confusing is how convincing the surface level can be. Because when you first observe this type of person, everything about them seems emotionally developed. They do not react too quickly. They do not get overwhelmed by small problems. They do not engage in unnecessary arguments. In fact, they often appear like the most composed presence in the room. This creates an immediate impression of emotional maturity, as if they have already mastered something that others are still struggling with. And the mind naturally respects that kind of presence. Human perception is heavily influenced by what is easy to observe. We judge emotional health through visible behavior, not invisible patterns. So when someone consistently appears composed, rational, and self-contained, the brain automatically assigns them a label of stability. It feels logical. It feels earned. But what is rarely understood is that emotional appearance and emotional availability are not the same system working together. They can function completely separately. This is where the illusion begins to form, because what looks like emotional strength is sometimes just emotional filtering. Instead of processing feelings deeply, some individuals learn to reduce emotional intensity internally before it ever reaches the surface. It is not that they experience less, it is that they allow less of it to be expressed. Over time, this creates a personality structure that seems steady but is actually built on controlled expression rather than open engagement. And to an outside observer, controlled expression looks like mastery. There is also another layer that strengthens this illusion. People who are emotionally avoidant often become very skilled at intellectual understanding of emotions. They can describe feelings accurately. They can explain relationship dynamics clearly. They can give advice that sounds thoughtful and balanced. This creates an impression that they are deeply aware of emotional life. But awareness does not always mean participation. Understanding emotions is not the same as being fully inside them. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Because when someone can explain emotional depth without actually staying in it, they appear grounded, even wise. But internally, they may still be keeping emotional distance as a protective habit. The mind becomes dominant over the heart, not in balance, but in control. Logic starts to replace emotional presence, not because emotion is absent, but because it is managed too tightly. And here is where human psychology plays a trick on perception. The brain associates predictability with trust. If someone behaves consistently, avoids chaos, and rarely shows extreme emotional shifts, the nervous system interprets that as safety. It feels easier to be around them. There is no uncertainty, no emotional volatility, no unpredictable reactions. So the body relaxes. But relaxation does not always mean emotional connection is deepening. Sometimes it only means emotional stimulation is being reduced. This is how many people mistake predictability for intimacy. Another powerful factor is how these individuals often avoid unnecessary conflict. They may not argue much. They may not express anger easily. They may prefer to step back rather than engage in emotional tension. On the surface, this looks like emotional intelligence, but in deeper analysis, it can also reflect discomfort with emotional intensity itself. Instead of navigating emotional friction, they reduce exposure to it altogether. And because modern relationships often associate no drama with healthy love, this behavior is praised instead of questioned. But there is a hidden cost. When emotional expression is consistently minimized, connection starts to lose depth. Not immediately, but gradually. Conversations may remain polite, even enjoyable, but something essential becomes missing. Emotional risk-taking disappears. Vulnerability becomes rare. And without vulnerability, intimacy cannot expand beyond a certain point. Still, because everything appears functional, the mind does not detect danger. This is the illusion that traps many people. It feels like progress because there is no obvious conflict. It feels like security because nothing is breaking. It feels like maturity because everything is controlled. But beneath that surface, emotional engagement is limited by an internal boundary that is never openly communicated. And this is where attachment psychology becomes important. When one person operates with emotional restriction while the other naturally seeks deeper connection, an invisible imbalance forms. One side experiences connection as something to regulate. The other experiences it as something to grow. This mismatch does not immediately create conflict. Instead, it creates interpretation errors. One person believes everything is fine because there is no chaos. The other senses something missing but cannot identify it clearly. So the gap between them does not scream, it whispers. And whispering problems are the hardest to notice early. Over time, this creates a strange emotional experience where everything appears correct on paper, but internally feels incomplete. The mind keeps searching for proof that nothing is wrong, while the emotional system keeps registering subtle absence. This contradiction creates mental exhaustion because the experience cannot be resolved through logic alone. What makes this even more deceptive is that the connection often begins in a way that feels promising. There is interest, there is attention, there is engagement at a comfortable level. But as emotional depth is naturally expected to grow, the internal boundary becomes more active. The same person who seemed open at the beginning begins to regulate closeness more carefully as things progress. Not because interest disappears, but because emotional exposure becomes harder to maintain. And this is where most people misunderstand the situation entirely. They assume inconsistency means loss of feeling, but in reality, it often reflects a limit in emotional endurance rather than a change in intention. The presence remains, but the depth reduces. The connection continues, but only within controlled limits. This creates a powerful psychological contradiction, because the surface still says, "I am here," while the emotional experience slowly begins to say, "not fully." And once this contradiction begins, the mind enters a phase of interpretation, adjustment, and self-questioning that slowly shifts the emotional balance without either person clearly realizing it. The real danger is not sudden loss. It is gradual limitation disguised as stability. At this stage, the experience starts to shift in a way that becomes harder to ignore, even if nothing clearly changes on the surface. Because what once felt naturally flowing now begins to feel slightly adjusted, almost like the emotional temperature has been lowered without explanation. The presence is still there, but the warmth that once made it feel effortless starts to fade in small degrees. It is not a sudden withdrawal. It is more like a gradual reduction in emotional intensity that is difficult to name but easy to feel. And this is where confusion begins to deepen. The human mind struggles with partial change. When something completely disappears, it becomes clear. But when something slowly reduces, the brain keeps trying to update its understanding without fully accepting the shift. So instead of recognizing a clear ending, it keeps searching for signs that everything is still the same. This creates a cycle of internal debate, where perception and reality start to compete. You begin to notice small differences in engagement. Replies may still come, but they lack the earlier emotional texture. Conversations may continue, but they feel more functional than expressive. The connection still exists in form, but not in depth. And because there is no explicit break, your mind keeps treating it as something unfinished rather than something changed. This is where emotional attachment becomes more active. When clarity is removed, the brain tries to restore certainty by investing more attention. You start observing more closely, you start analyzing tone, timing, and behavior patterns. You begin reading meaning into small details that you previously ignored. This constant monitoring creates mental fatigue, but at the same time, it strengthens emotional involvement. It is a strange cycle. The less clarity you receive, the more attention you give, and the more attention you give, the harder it becomes to detach emotionally. At the same time, another psychological mechanism starts to form. Because there are still moments of connection, even if they are reduced, hope remains active. These brief returns of closeness create a powerful emotional contrast. When distance is followed by even small engagement, the relief feels stronger than it should. And that relief gets stored in memory as something meaningful. This pattern trains the mind to wait, not for consistency, but for return. And waiting changes emotional balance without permission. It shifts focus from what is present to what might come back. It turns the relationship experience into anticipation rather than reality. And anticipation is one of the strongest forces in human attachment because it keeps attention locked on potential rather than current state. Meanwhile, the person on the other side continues operating within their own emotional limits. They may not experience the same level of urgency or confusion. For them, maintaining distance while staying connected still feels normal. They can engage, withdraw, and re-engage without feeling internal contradiction. But for the other side, This rhythm creates emotional instability because consistency is expected but not received. And this difference in emotional processing creates invisible strain. One side adapts by regulating closeness, the other side adapts by increasing emotional effort. Without realizing it, the balance shifts. One person becomes the gatekeeper of depth, while the other becomes the seeker of it. This imbalance does not need conflict to exist. It survives quietly through behavior patterns that never get openly discussed. Over time, emotional self-regulation becomes one-sided. You begin to adjust your expression to match what seems acceptable. You hold back certain needs to avoid disruption. You reduce emotional requests to maintain connection. These changes feel small individually, but collectively they reshape the entire dynamic. Because when one side continuously adapts, the relationship no longer develops evenly. It starts to orbit around limitation instead of expansion. And yet from the outside, nothing appears visibly wrong. This is what makes the pattern so difficult to recognize early. There is no dramatic breakdown. There is no clear rejection. There is only a steady reduction in emotional exchange that feels explainable in isolation, but concerning when viewed as a whole. Another important aspect emerges during this phase. The mind starts to normalize inconsistency. What once felt unusual slowly becomes expected. When emotional presence fluctuates repeatedly, the nervous system begins to adapt to unpredictability, and once adaptation happens, emotional inconsistency stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like the standard. This is one of the most subtle psychological shifts, because once inconsistency becomes familiar, it no longer triggers the same resistance. Instead, it becomes part of the emotional routine, and at that point, the connection is no longer evaluated by how it feels overall, but by how it feels in its best moments. The lowest points are no longer measured against expectations. They are simply accepted as part of the cycle. This creates a powerful distortion in perception. You start defining the entire experience based on moments of emotional return, rather than emotional continuity. The good moments feel like proof of connection. The distant moments feel like temporary phases. And because the brain naturally prioritizes positive reinforcement, the memory of closeness becomes stronger than the reality of distance. This imbalance in memory strengthens emotional dependence. Even when clarity is missing, the mind keeps referencing the most rewarding interactions as justification to remain invested. It begins to believe that connection is still intact, even when sustained depth is absent. And this belief keeps the emotional system engaged long after the structural foundation has weakened. What makes this even more complex is the internal conflict it creates. Part of you recognizes the inconsistency. Another part holds on to the positive experiences. And between these two interpretations, emotional tension builds, not through events, but through contradiction. This is the silent pressure that many people experience without being able to describe it clearly. It feels like something is unfinished, but also like something is still alive. It feels like connection exists, but also like it is restricted. And this dual perception keeps the mind in a state of continuous evaluation, never fully settling into acceptance or release. And as this continues, emotional clarity becomes harder to access, because attention is no longer directed at reality as it is, but at fragments of experience that do not fully represent the whole picture. This is where awareness becomes essential, because once you understand how these patterns form through subtle reinforcement rather than obvious actions, you start to see that the struggle is not about intensity, but about structure, not about feelings alone, but about how emotional availability is consistently expressed or withheld over time. And this realization prepares you for the deeper truth behind why this pattern repeats across different situations, even when people seem completely different on the surface. At this point, the pattern becomes clearer when seen from a wider perspective, because what feels personal is actually part of a repeatable emotional structure that appears across many connections. The mind often tries to personalize these experiences. It assumes that the issue must be about compatibility, timing, or effort. But in reality, what is unfolding is a predictable attachment-style response that activates under closeness. It is not random behavior. It follows a consistent internal rule system shaped by past emotional conditioning and protective learning. When emotional closeness increases beyond a certain threshold, an internal alarm is triggered. This does not always show up as visible rejection or conflict. Instead, it appears as reduction in engagement, slower emotional responsiveness, and a subtle withdrawal from deeper exchange. The person does not necessarily decide to step away consciously. It happens automatically as a form of self-regulation. This is important to understand because it removes the assumption of intention-based harm. In many cases, the distancing is not meant to punish or confuse the other person. It is a coping response designed to reduce internal discomfort. The nervous system associates deep emotional exposure with vulnerability that feels unsafe, so it reduces intensity in order to restore equilibrium. This creates a pattern where closeness itself becomes the trigger for emotional retreat, and this is where relational imbalance begins to stabilize itself. Because while one side interprets closeness as bonding, the other side interprets it as pressure accumulation. The same interaction is experienced differently depending on internal emotional wiring. This difference does not cause immediate separation. Instead, it creates a slow divergence in how each person interprets the same reality. One continues to move forward emotionally, the other regulates by stepping back internally. Over time, this creates a rhythm that feels inconsistent from one perspective and controlled from the other, but neither side fully understands the experience of the other. This lack of mutual internal visibility becomes the foundation of misunderstanding. Another important layer is how emotional restraint is often mistaken for strength. In many social environments, people who do not express strong emotional reactions are seen as stable and dependable. Calmness is associated with maturity. Silence during emotional moments is interpreted as control. But what is rarely considered is that emotional suppression can also produce similar outward behavior. So two very different internal states can produce one similar external result. This is where perception becomes unreliable. Because what is visible is not always what is real. A person can appear composed while internally disengaging. They can appear present while emotionally stepping away. And since most people evaluate connection based on visible signals, they miss the internal process completely. This creates a false conclusion that everything is fine. Meanwhile, the emotional system of the other person continues to respond to subtle changes that are not being acknowledged. This mismatch between visible behavior and felt experience is what leads to prolonged uncertainty. The surface suggests continuity, but the emotional reality suggests reduction. And when these two signals conflict, the mind naturally tries to resolve the contradiction. It does this by increasing emotional investment, hoping that clarity will eventually emerge. But instead of clarity, what often develops is adaptation. The more confusion persists, the more the mind adjusts expectations to match the available emotional input. This adjustment is gradual but powerful because it reshapes what feels normal. Eventually, lower emotional engagement stops feeling unusual. Another layer that strengthens this cycle is reinforcement through intermittent connection. When emotional presence returns after a period of distance, it creates a strong contrast effect. The relief experienced during reconnection feels amplified compared to the discomfort of separation. This difference conditions the emotional system to prioritize restoration moments rather than consistent availability. So attention becomes anchored to recovery instead of stability. And this anchoring shifts the entire emotional focus. Instead of evaluating overall consistency, the mind begins to value moments of reconnection more heavily than the gaps between them. This creates an emotional bias where brief closeness outweighs prolonged distance in perceived importance. This is how attachment deepens without stability increasing. At the same time, the avoidant structure continues operating within its own boundaries. There is no intentional cycle of confusion. There is simply a regulated pattern of engagement that remains within comfortable emotional limits. But from the outside, this pattern appears unpredictable because it does not align with the expectation of linear emotional growth. This mismatch is where emotional strain develops. Because one system is built on expansion of closeness, while the other is built on limitation of exposure. These two systems are not inherently incompatible, but they require awareness to function together. Without awareness, Each side interprets the other through its own emotional logic, which leads to misreading of behavior. One interprets distance as loss of interest. The other interprets closeness as overload. Neither interpretation fully captures the internal truth of the other side. And this is why communication alone does not always resolve the experience, because the core difference is not about words, but about emotional capacity and regulation thresholds. Unless this is understood, conversations remain on the surface level while the deeper pattern continues unchanged. Over time, repeated cycles of partial engagement and partial withdrawal create emotional conditioning. The nervous system learns to stay alert, to monitor shifts, and to anticipate changes. This heightened sensitivity increases emotional exhaustion because the system is never allowed to fully settle. And yet, paradoxically, it also increases attachment, because attention becomes tied to unpredictability, and unpredictability creates mental fixation. The more uncertain the pattern, the more energy the mind invests in trying to stabilize it internally. This is how emotional involvement grows even when consistency does not. Eventually, a quiet realization begins to form, not through dramatic events, but through accumulated experience. The recognition that effort alone does not transform structure. That emotional availability has limits that cannot always be expanded through understanding or patience. And that connection requires not only presence, but sustained capacity for depth. This realization is not immediate. It emerges slowly as patterns repeat and outcomes remain familiar. And once it becomes clear, it changes how future emotional signals are interpreted. Not with fear, but with clarity. Because understanding the structure behind behavior removes the illusion that inconsistency is accidental. It reveals that what feels confusing is often simply misaligned emotional systems operating without shared depth.